Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jeannine Forrest, and I welcome you to Dementia Unplugged. Today, we will be talking about ambiguous loss and caregiver grief. Before we start sort of the details of the show, I'd like to share a message from the president of the Dementia Society of America, Kevin Jamieson.
Welcome. Please listen to this important message from the Dementia Society of America. All content, including any potential medical information, is provided as an informational resource only and is not to be used or relied on for any diagnostic or treatment process. It should not be used as a substitute for professional diagnosis, care, and treatment. Please consult your healthcare provider before making any healthcare decisions or for guidance about a specific medical condition. The opinions expressed and the content shared by Dr. Forrest are not necessarily the opinions and content of the Dementia Society of America. Thank you.
In this session, typically I talk for about 30 minutes and then open it up to question and answer, for which you can submit a question through the chat button. And I always like to start our programs making sure that we're on sort of the same page and have the same terminology by what is meant by dementia. Think of dementia as an umbrella term. And there are many, many different types, subtypes of dementias, similar to the word cancer. There may be breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer. And so dementia is sort of this overarching term for which the subtypes present itself in different ways and typically impact cognitive functions such as memory, decision-making, reasoning, and motor functions as well, the ability to sort of ultimately feed oneself, the ability to control bowel and bladder, the ability to swallow, those kinds of things. So that's just sort of a very brief overview. But I want you to come away knowing that dementia in it itself, the word dementia does not mean it's a disease, okay? Many, many different subtypes of conditions. So let's get started. Ambiguous loss and caregiver grief. I want to start out by saying as well that this particular program may not be easy to listen to. To talk about grief, it's something that our culture sort of rallies against, right? We're always expected to kind of keep a stiff upper lip and present ourselves as independent and just happy all the time, when in fact we know that's not the reality. And although I'll be focusing on caregiver grief, I do not want to negate the fact that people living with dementia go through their own processing of grief. And grief is a universal, and I want to underline, normal thoughts and feelings that follow a loss, a significant loss, and at death. So grief is a normal reaction, and it can present itself in different ways. It can look like anger, feel like denial, guilt, sadness, and often it could be all of those at the same time. But that's what it looks like when we're talking about grief. I have a quote for those of you who are just listening that says, caregiving, often calls us to lean into love we didn't know was possible. It's a quote by Tia Walker. Caregiving often calls us to lean into love we didn't know was possible. And grief is often dependent on the relationship and the degree and the strength of that relationship and the depth of the love to the person. And so often, as many of you who are on this podcast know, that caregivers are leaning into types of love perhaps you didn't know was possible. Given that fact, the depth of grieving is unique to you and difficult at times. So, what's different about grief for people caring for others with various types of dementias? What's particularly unique is that individuals experience multiple losses before the actual physical death. It may be the companionship. It may be the ability to have shared experiences. It's not having a partner or a loved one who used to do same things, different traditions. And so there is a grieving of multiple losses before the death. And often there's limited time to adjust and absorb what's happening and what's changing before there's an additional, this is sort of compounded grief. The other piece that makes this type of grief unique is that there's an uncertain sort of timeline or path, or what we like to call trajectory over time. People with dementia can live many years. That said, there may be underlying physical conditions such as heart disease or a cancer or a diabetes that may sort of create the death much sooner. But there's a great deal of uncertainty. The point I want to highlight here is that in our American culture, at least, grief is only, for the most part, recognized following a physical death. And so, as caregivers, and I put myself in this situation as well, we are experiencing multiple losses before the physical death. And we don't always recognize the fact that we're grieving because we live in a culture that doesn't understand that. And so there's a term to this called disenfranchised grief. It means it's not socially sanctioned. You don't see many cards saying, oh, I am so sorry for the loss of the fact that your mother no longer recognizes who you are, right? And so there's this sense of feeling abandoned or all alone. And it's much more easily to become overwhelmed in this sense of grief. Just to make a discernment here, a distinction between mourning and grief. Mourning is the outward expression of grieving to others. And so one could be grieving, and it's much more an internal process. We can feel sad, we can feel anger, but we may not show that to the world, right? Because of this very disenfranchised grief experience. It's not well understood by others. And so often we walk around with this happy face, getting through the day. And yet, if we let ourselves grieve authentically, we will be showing our mourning. And it is a process that is a way of adapting to these losses, and it's necessary. Grief isn't the only caregiver emotion, right? People are worried, anxious, confused, resentful, lonely, not only angry, fearful, guilty, tired, sad, all of those. Um, and all of those can be happening sort of like a whirlwind throughout the day or over the days. And yet often we put on that happy face. But today we're targeting grief. A point I want listeners to take away that is that grief and mourning are absolutely essential to eventual healing. If we don't let ourselves grieve and we don't let ourselves mourn, healing will be stunted over time, and it often presents itself in sort of dysfunctional or unhealthy behaviors, including addictions, overeating, addictions to alcohol, drugs, other ways of trauma. And so please, for all of us who are listening and going through this, know that it's essential to really share ourselves. It may not be with everyone, but for someone who would listen and understand. Now, what do people grieve, particularly in the early stage? And I'll go through early, middle, and late stages. But for those of you who may be listening and want to know how to offer support, or those of you who are in the midst of it and can't quite understand why you're angry or irritable all the time, know that you are grieving. And grieving starts, following a diagnosis. Quite often it's intense grief. Because one, if you had a crystal ball, you're looking into all those potential changes, all those plans that we had in our head, the way life, quote, should be, that's not the way life will be. And so we're anticipating all these future changes, whether that be changes in employment, different abilities in terms of roles and responsibilities around the household, or taking care of children or grandchildren. Plans for travel might be curtailed or changed. Many look at sort of the financial impact of loving and being a caregiver to someone with dementia. There's that unmet need, that change for, that need for companionship that will be changed over time. And yes, my intent here is not to make everyone, sit there with a box of Kleenex today. That's not it. But this is our unplugged, unvarnished version. And I don't want to be Pollyannish about this. Because in fact, if we remain Pollyannish about it and negate the fact that someone is grieving, it makes this experience much more lonely. So, what helps? I'm not going to say what fixes it, but what might ease some of this discomfort in the early stages? Learn as much as you can about the type of dementia your loved one has. Because there are differences in communicating. So for example, people with frontotemporal dementia, initially, memory may not be as impacted as someone with Alzheimer's dementia. And so you need to be able to communicate more efficiently and differently. And so learning as much as you can, and that's, I'm grateful you're here. And those of you who have consistently listened to these webcasts, because you're learning to do things differently. You want to be open and plan ahead in the early stages. So sort of what are the legal documents, the powers of attorney for healthcare, the powers attorney for finances, and so on, that need to be reviewed early on while the person with dementia can still make decisions. I'll also encourage any one of you in the early stages to be open to support. Quite often in my private practice, what I see is people wait to the very last minute where they're barely hanging on to ask for help. Help can still be given and support can still be given. But by that time, they're much more exhausted, much more at risk for their own illness, health problems, stress related often. I will encourage you to journal. If you haven't done this practice before, write down your thoughts. Getting it out on paper. If you don't have someone to speak to, at least write it out. And start to integrate routine self-care up front, whether that be taking a daily walk, taking a bubble bath with candles, reading something important to you, getting out in the fresh air. In the title of this webcast, we talk about ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is a term that was coined by family therapist and researcher Dr. Pauline Boss. She's out of the University of Minnesota. Fascinating concept. Ambiguous loss can mean two different things: that the person is physically present, but mentally and emotionally, in her words, gone. I like to use the word changed, because people can still be mentally, emotionally present, but it's different. So if I were to take the liberty of adjusting and tweaking her definition, I would like to use the word changed. Ambiguous loss can also mean someone who is not physically present, but yet unsure of where someone stands in the relationship. This initially came out of people who were prisoners of war or spouses of people who were prisoners of war, and not knowing if that person was alive or dead. So am I married? Am I still married? Am I not? Am I a widow? Am I not? Where and who am I in relationship to this person who's not physically present, but in my mind and heart they're present? And so there's no clear distinction. But with dementia, we are talking about someone who's physically present, but mentally and emotionally changed. And so there's a sense of still feeling alone, not as connected, it's like living with a stranger at times. There's a disconnect and an unclear resolution. When is this going to end? And what will that look and feel like? And so some of you listening today may be experiencing this concept of ambiguous loss. So how do we navigate this ambiguous loss? It's important to acknowledge what is changed or lost, and use this phrase: we're going to be living with both and. So yes, my loved one, yes, they can no longer, let's say, dress independently. And we can spend time enjoying breakfast together. My mother no longer recognized who I am. right? And we can still sing church hymns together. So it is this, it's not all bad all the time. The person isn't, you know, there's still that core person, sort of this core element, their spiritual sense, and that's my belief, that still remains. And so it forces us, or at least guides us, to appreciate the moments. And so there's some beauty into this both and. Yes, it's difficult, and we don't want to gloss over how difficult things are in terms of the changes. But and gives us the opportunity to look for what still is and what still brings joy. In the middle stage, we still bring this both and mindset, but what's happening is you will recognize that there will be more responsibility for the caregiver physically, often sort of trying to hold up all the spinning plates at the same time. And these happen despite your best efforts. And this is what's so frustrating. We're all trying our best and sort of hoping things don't change. But unfortunately, we don't have a cure yet. And many of the dementias are like slow moving icebergs where the changes happen regardless in terms of cognitive functioning and physical decline. And so there may be more of an intensity in terms of loss of that companionship and intimacy, and even, having someone else to drive or having someone else problem solve. And so those shared experience and memories are changed. And so the adult children often take on much more of a parental role. And daily routines are different. Traditions, of holidays, for example, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Hanukkah, no longer take on the same sort of intense, deeply held traditions because they need to be modified in order to be enjoyed by the person with the changing brain. Where I see a lot of struggle, especially in the middle stages, is when the person with whatever type of dementia has these moments of clarity, these moments of lucidity. And it is physiologic. The brain is breaking and changing. And I have a picture of a brain with a big bandage on it. And it's important we remember that. But there are neuronal connections, the nerve cells within the brains that fire differently and often become less functional with fatigue. And so the person that you're caring for might have these moments of showing their former self for moments, sparks at a time, maybe a few hours at best at a time. And then they sort of revert back to the person with these losses when you look through that lens. And so that is so hard because I see caregivers saying, oh my gosh, they're getting better, aren't they? And my response is, they're changing. Think of it like a loose light bulb. Moments it connects, and there's other moments it disconnects. But when it does, just appreciate that moment. But unfortunately, no, the brain isn't necessarily healing. It's changing, and it continues. So in this middle stage, allow yourself to mourn. Be with people who really understand. Perhaps it's this place. Look for support groups. Look for people who are going through or have been through the dementia sort of journey. Continue to acknowledge what's lost, but we know that we can't sit in this grief 24 hours a day in order to be able to function. If you have other caregiving responsibility with little children or work, and so distraction in the form of work or hobbies or other ways to distract ourselves is helpful, useful, and healthy. We call it compartmentalization. We need to do that in order to be able to function. And that's okay. That said, don't avoid talking about your grief and mourn to others, because if there's chronic suppression, one does become at risk, for outrage, anger, as I said before, alcohol, drug, food addictions, and depression. There's a significant amount of caregivers who become depressed, often because they don't share how they're really feeling. So reach out. In the middle stages, to navigate this grief, what has been helpful through research, my own practice, and in my own family life is to be present without judgment. You're kind of watching these behaviors and changes, and you're going with the flow. You're not being judgmental of the fact that a person can't do X, Y, or Z. It is happening. I can appreciate it. And I have to adapt my world around their brain changes. I have to be able to adapt my responses. I can no longer expect someone to do different because it's their brains that are hurting and changing, not mine. And that's a useful way of being. It's a way of incorporating and adapting to life in a new way. In the late stages, for those of you going through it or those of you thinking, yes, there are more profound changes in cognitive abilities and the ability to communicate, and language, and it may be lost. The person may become mute or just use fragments of words. They need more physical assistance in terms of all activities, bathing, dressing, changing, toileting. And so that person with the dementia loses the ability to apologize if that was a plan, or to reason, or to forgive. And so you're sitting in this in-betweenness, this threshold. And so the losses can become more profound. That said, what is helpful is to learn to be present with these difficult feelings of being unresolved feelings, the ambiguity, the suffering. And so mindfulness, the ability to meditate mindfully, which means being able to sit with difficult, very difficult feelings and let them go through you and experience them. But that doesn't mean you have to chase them and be negatively impacted all the time. And so other ways to get through this is to connect to people, not through language, because that ability is changed, but to connect through the senses. And that would be through things like music and touch and smell and taste. For many, their faith traditions become more into focus. So the spiritual support, prayer can be useful, certainly for many throughout all of this journey. There are two particular exercises that have been useful throughout, but I pointed here in late stage as things become more acutely changed. Breathing exercises. Don't forget to breathe. I put it in your phone. Every few hours, take 4 deep breaths and just be present. Grounding really means being connected to the earth, being connected to your senses. So if you're feeling overwhelmed and overstressed in this situation, literally put your feet on the ground. Try it right now. Put your feet on the ground and feel your feet connected. What do your toes feel like? What is the temperature? What is the texture of your shoe or your slipper or the hard ground? Is it cold? Is it soft? What is it? Some people look around. What you want to do is just stop for a moment and look in your physical space. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you touch? Are you touching a desk? Are you touching, your shirt? Connect to each one of your senses, and that really helps to circumvent if you're spiraling in terms of anxiety and feeling overwhelmed. So grounding literally means to connect to the senses. Other ways to gather support is through your community at large, different centers, support groups, of course. It could be a church, synagogue, right? Then hospice care in late stage is a wonderful service that provides support into late and final stages, until death and beyond, during bereavement. If you are someone listening in as a friend, as a relative, as a neighbor, and want to know how to help, or I say offer support, I will embellish you to provide non-judgmental listening. Be present. Do not offer advice. People need to be able to heal, and you giving them, this is what you need to do, should do, this is what I went through, this is what works, does not really help an individual's own healing. And so it's the ability to listen and be present within their difficult time. Let the person tell their story over and over and over again. Now, you could offer practical helps with laundry, right? Getting groceries, those kinds of things, if you're less comfortable being present. And that's an alternative. But what's been most helpful to me and to others is when you can be there and listen. And it's offering empathy, not sympathy, empathy. And I think animals, pets can be the best empathy providers because they sit and listen and are present. And empathy fuels connection. Sympathy does not. What it means to empathize is to feel with people, not for people. And I encourage you never to use the words "at least." And it looks something like this. Well, yes, your husband can no longer work because he has, let's say, early onset dementia. But at least you have a husband, right? At least. So this "at least" minimizes and diminishes what people are experiencing. So please don't use that phrase. I would point you to a wonderful YouTube video by Dr. Brene Brown, who has her PhD in social work, wonderful researcher. And she has this YouTube video, the difference between sympathy and empathy. Look that up. It's a wonderful, almost very practical way of looking at the difference. But we need to be empathic. All right, as we move towards bereavement, and I'll be wrapping this up. Bereavement is the grief and mourning that follows the physical death. And what helps literally is to go down to the basics, making sure that you're eating and drinking and getting sleep and fresh air. For many of us who've gone through this experience, know that a sense of relief is often a very normal and natural emotion in response to the death. There's no need to feel guilty about feeling relief. And so the grief can come in waves following the physical death. And so that's why rituals often, maybe perhaps through traditions or faith-based rituals are important. Being in nature, being connected to the cycle of life is important. And in bereavement, please know there's nothing to fix because it's not broken. Bereavement is a natural response, the mourning, a natural response to have loved. And so what's possible following this journey and this grief and mourning and bereavement is that some of us can become more resilient. Some of us go through a metamorphosis like a butterfly, and growth and development are possible. And that includes deep gratitude for what is and the lessons we've learned while caregiving and caring for someone with dementia. So we're learning to care, caring for others in grief, caring for ourselves before finding the cure or cures for the different dementias. I want to thank the Dementia Society of America for this opportunity to hold this webcast, Dementia Unplugged. It's a wonderful resource. I would encourage all of you to take a look and donate if possible. If any of you would like additional assistance, one-on-one coaching guidance from me, please don't hesitate to contact me. My private practice is called Through the Forest. I offer services called Dementia Coach on Call. And you can reach me at Dementia Coach on Call or 773-704-1834. I will be ending the recording on the next slide. And at that point, I want you to start bumbling up and thinking of your different types of questions.